Okay, so today we're going to be discussing how language can be connected to nationalism and is often kind of a precursor or a beginning to nationalism, and how those things can lead to conflict. This is all going to take place in really the century before World War One, but a lot of the events are going to happen just a few years before World War One. And so, again, our objective is really to see how language can connect to nationalism and how this can eventually lead to conflict, even really bloody conflict. So, before we get going, let's just take a look at our map here. The countries of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire would all be considered the central powers in World War One. Again, this is Europe in 1914, so of course the political boundaries of the countries look a little bit different. But I want you to draw your attention to a little country called Serbia. It's on the southern end of Austria-Hungary, and it's to the west of Bulgaria. And this region that Serbia is in, along with Bulgaria and Albania and Montenegro, this is called the Balkan Peninsula. And for about a century before World War One, this was a region of intense nationalism, and because of that conflict, you had a lot of different ethnic groups kind of jammed into this one peninsula, all of whom wanted their own nation states. We'll talk about what nation states are. But before we get going, let's also consider what exactly is it that leads to nationalism. Remember, nationalism is like a kind of pride in the cultural institutions that unite a group of people. Nationalism can also just be the things that unite a group of people. But let's just look at a few questions. I mean, political borders very often are not the best way to consider nationalism. Political borders can kind of separate things arbitrarily, and we'll see how that takes place later. But for instance, with Austria, the political borders of Austria included Germans, Czechs, Poles, all these different ethnic groups, and so it'd be hard to actually unite them just based on borders. Other things like common ruler are kind of a similar situation. It's hard to get united just because you all have the same ruler. Common goals, you're getting a little bit closer towards nationalism. The United States is a good example of that. It's a really diverse place, but supposedly people in the United States value things like liberty and economic freedom. But things like common culture, common religion, and especially common language can really strengthen a group of people's nationalism because very often they indicate that the people think similarly. And so during the 19th century, so it's the 1800s, there were lots of groups of people who wanted to form what we would consider nation states. Nation state is kind of it's like a political boundary that encompasses similar people. So ethnically, linguistically, religiously, culturally. For instance, today the United States is generally not a nation state. We might think of a country like Great Britain as more of a nation state, but even that today is a really, really diverse place. And so during the 19th century, a nation state was different than something like an empire. An empire covered lots of different ethnic, language, and religious groups. So let's think about the reasons why language is so important to nationalism, and why language would be a kind of a uniting force behind creating a nation state. So language really reflects a way of thinking. That's the first thing to consider. For instance, when anthropologists are wanting to study a new culture, one of the first things they have to do is learn the language. This is why it's been so difficult to study, for instance, really ancient history, because you have to know the language. Even if you knew the language, though, generally you would have to know, for instance, like the geography and the common events through there, because language is built through history and geography. If you were to, if you were put in a time portal from 50 years ago and brought to the present day, you would have no idea what a lot of the languages that we use today, things like memes or even the internet, is not something that was familiar to people 50 years ago. But also, geography plays an important role. For instance, some indigenous tribes in Alaska have, dozens of different words for white or snow because they encounter it so often, and there's so many different types of snow and so many different types of the color white. And so language really comes from both history and geography. And another thing to consider is that your cultural traditions are passed on through your language. And so the words that you use with your language are very intimately tied to your culture. And so for these reasons, language and culture are very similar and a good precursor to nationalism. So if we look at the different language families of Europe, very often these indicated different kinds of cultures. So here you've got red, blue, green, and brown as kind of the primary colors in this. Those are Germanic, Latin, Slavic, and Indo-Iranian. We're not really going to look at Indo-Iranian too much because it was not necessarily a part of European language families, although many of these languages actually derive from Indo-European or Indo-Iranian. You've also got some other smaller families like Baltic, Greek, Armenian, Albanian, and Celtic. Something to keep in mind, though, is these languages move with people, and so they evolve with people. And so as people have moved into different regions or migrated into different regions of Europe, they've brought their language, and they've become then sedentary or stationary, and their language has evolved. And so even though Germanic languages encompass everything from English to German to Norwegian, these languages are different. But with that said, very often the people who speak those same languages share some cultural traditions. And so, for instance, English and Dutch, some people consider those cultures more similar than, say, Dutch and French. So within these Germanic language families, there are lots and lots of different languages, but very often the people of those languages feel some sort of cultural connection. Not always, but often. Other examples of this are the Romance languages, which really kind of derived from Latin and moved with the with the Roman Empire. And so Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, Sicilian, these are languages that would be considered the Romance languages or Latin languages. And again, these kind of moved with the Roman Empire. Just as a point of divergence, the Germanic languages very often were languages of people that the Romans fought. And so you have very often this kind of discrepancy between those two cultures. And then Slavic languages are another kind of different language group. Some Slavic languages mix with Germanic languages on the border between what's today like Poland and Germany, but for the most part, this is a completely separate, different language family. The biggest country that speaks Slavic languages are Russia, but Ukraine, Czech Republic, and Serbia, these are all nations today that speak Slavic languages. Slavic can be divided into a few different kind of sections of the Slavic language family, and there are some cultural tensions between those. So, for instance, East Slavic and South Slavic are a little bit different, and some people in East Slavic countries may think of South Slavic countries as somehow different from their own culture. But for the most part, they share some sort of language root, and those languages are similar, and those cultural institutions are a little bit more similar. So let's see how an empire would be different from a nation state. And so the Austria-Hungary Empire, for instance, had all of these different languages within it. Not just languages, but language families. So it's not like they were all speaking different kinds of Germanic languages. They were speaking not only Germanic, Latin, Slavic, but also other languages that really had no roots in any of those language families. Nevertheless, it was ruled from Austria, which was a Germanic language-speaking place. It was largely like Silesian, which is a kind of Germanic people. And they shared a lot more cultural ties to, say, people in Germany than they did to, say, people in Hungary. It was ruled from Vienna, which was in the eastern part of Austria, but still a Germanic place. And as a result of this, Austria-Hungary and Germany had an alliance in 1878. It was called the Dual Alliance, and in many ways it found common ground in their German language and culture. Of course, Austria is only partly Germanic. It's mostly an empire. And this empire was ruled by this family known as the Habsburg dynasty. Franz Joseph was the ruler at the outbreak of World War I, and he was in his 80s. And in a lot of ways, he was really conservative. He was this kind of carryover almost from like medieval times. He ruled pretty autocratically. In other words, it was like kind of his way or the highway. and he ruled from Vienna, which was this like really old school kind of European Germanic type kingdom or city. This phrase that the Austrians used, Fortwurstone, is a good indication of how the Austria-Hungary Empire carried on. And this phrase basically means keep improvising, keep slogging on, and keep clowning. It's kind of a combination of those phrases, but the basic idea here is that Austria-Hungary was just kind of lumbering on, keeping control of all these different kinds of people, but really it was kind of losing them in the long run. So again, here you've got all these different language families represented in the Austria-Hungary Empire. So it's certainly not a unified culture. A nation state wants a unified culture in many ways. And so let's turn to the Balkan Peninsula. Today, countries like Bosnia and Serbia are mostly composed of Serbs, which that's a Slavic-speaking Eastern Orthodox, that's the religion, people. And there are other ethnic groups and language groups within the Balkan Peninsula. But at this time, Serbs were kind of split between the Austria-Hungary Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and some were wanting their own nation state. And as the 19th century wore on, more and more people wanted to be part of this own independent kingdom. And so Serbia became this kind of dream of a lot of Serbian people, which would be this separate kingdom composed of Serbs. Part of what would be Serbia was in the Austria-Hungary Empire, part was in the Ottoman Empire. And so a series of wars were actually fought to break away these pieces and create a unified Serbia. So, for instance, in 1912, a lot of this territory was taken from the Ottoman Empire. But at the start of World War I, there was still a group of Serbs in a region called Bosnia, which is over here to the west of Serbia in pink. And there were lots of Serbs who wanted Bosnia to be liberated from the Austria-Hungary Empire. They wanted to create their own nation state. Now, even at this time, it was kind of problematic because there were only like 40% Serbs in Serbia. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there would have been this unified Serbia. It was that they wanted to create a unified Serbia. And so it's important to remember that, what people want is not necessarily a geographic certainty. It's not like you can just create this entire nation full of only Serbs. People are spread out in different regions. People have been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so everybody has a different claim to the land. And so a majority of people in Serbia, or actually a plurality, not even a majority, wanted to create this separate nation of Serbs separate from Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Now, this worried the Austria-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, partly because this would create like a new Serbian kingdom, which could challenge them for power, but also because Serbs were Slavic, and Russia was an ally of Serbia, and in many ways the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans thought that a separate Serbian kingdom would mean increasing Russian influence. And Russia was always kind of portrayed as this like encroaching power that was getting closer and closer south. In many ways, this was because Russia had this basically really cold northern frontier, and it wanted more southern coastal ports. Here you can even see one of the tentacles wrapping around the Crimea, and even today Russia is still expanding southward. And so this worried the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans. They thought Serbia would just become this kind of placeholder for Russia. And when World War I broke out, Russia would actually side with Serbia. Now, let's go back to this Serbian nationalism, this idea that the Serbs wanted their own kingdom. So the assassination that set off World War I was a Serbian nationalist who assassinated this guy, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This guy was an assassin. He was a terrorist, basically, and he, in Sarajevo, which was the capital of Bosnia, which was under Austro-Hungarian control, this man, Gavrilo Princip, actually assassinated Franz Ferdinand and his wife. He was a Serbian nationalist, and so what he wanted was actually liberation for Serbia. After this, Austria-Hungary made a series of demands to Serbia. Serbia couldn't meet it. There was a war declaration declared, and then this unleashed this kind of chain reaction of alliances, and that that started World War I. So we could see within Austria-Hungary these tensions between language and culture under an empire really led to conflict. The same thing was happening in the Ottoman Empire. Now, again, the Ottoman Empire is this really, really old empire. It's over 600 years old, and it ruled from Constantinople, which today we know as Istanbul. This used to be the Byzantine Empire, so if we go all the way back from Rome, the Roman Empire broke up into two empires, East and West. The Eastern Empire was based in Byzantine. Under the Byzantine Empire, it was ruled from Byzantium, and then when the Ottomans took over, they renamed Byzantium Constantinople, and they took over a lot of the territory. This was the same empire, so in some ways, this is kind of like an evolution of the Holy Roman Empire still in existence, or the Roman Empire. Now, in 1914, of course, the Ottoman Empire was in serious decline. It hadn't industrialized. There were all these separate little groups who wanted their own nation states, and it was ruling over this extremely multi-ethnic empire in the same way that Austria-Hungary was. So, for instance, it was ruled from what's today Turkey, or the Anatolian Peninsula. This was the center of power, and this was ruled by people who were Turks. They spoke Turkish, and they had a similar culture. They were Muslim. They were really not from the area. The Turkish people had migrated here from Central Asia, hundreds of years ago, and they had kind of swept in and conquered what was then the Byzantine Empire and turned it into the Ottoman Empire. So they were not from around there. Yet they were ruling over Arabs, Serbs, Armenians in this, and again, this was after a period decline. This is all the Ottoman Empire had, but they were still ruling over these different ethnic groups. And so, for instance, Armenia here is indicated in red. And what many of these ethnic groups wanted was different from what the Ottoman Empire wanted. So if the Ottoman Empire joins up with Austria-Hungary, that doesn't necessarily mean Armenians want to do that. They want their own nation state. For instance, just Arab language dialects, that's its own language family, and they were being ruled by Ottomans in the Middle East. So today's Israel, Jordan, Iraq, that was all part of the Ottoman Empire. And they spoke different languages. Even though they're Muslim, they don't necessarily share cultural ties. So the Arabs, for instance, wanted their own nation state. And what I want to do, though, is point out how this cultural conflict and language conflict can lead to really terrible things. Once the war was declared in 1914, Ottomans were concerned with making sure that their empire stayed together. And some groups of Turkish religious leaders declared war on these allied forces. And Armenia, meanwhile, wanted to side with the Russians. They were more sympathetic to all this idea of separate nation states in the Balkans. And even though the Armenians were on the other side of the Anatolian Peninsula, they were sympathetic to the nationalist cause. The Turks, or some groups of Turks, saw this as a threat. They saw this as kind of a Christian-Muslim conflict, and the Turks systematically killed up to 850,000 civilians, so men, women, and children who were not soldiers. And they did this by trying to march them actually out of the Ottoman Empire, and on the way, most of them died. And so what I want to do then is bring about some conclusions. So first of all, it's important to remember that shared language often means shared culture, which often leads to nationalism. And in the 19th century and into the 20th century, there was a big push to achieve nation states, which were nations with political boundaries that encompassed people who were ethnically and linguistically similar. Another thing to keep in mind is that shared language and culture led to alliances. So Austria-Hungary and Germany had an alliance because of this. Russia and Serbia had an alliance because of this. And another thing to keep in mind is nationalist movements were a response to these European empires. So the Austria-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, nation states wanted to break away from these. But lastly, it's important to remember that nationalism can very often lead to really bloody conflict, like World War I, genocide, and even conflicts today. Okay, so that's it, and thanks for paying attention. Oh, and here's kind of the result. So because of these conflicts, you have what was in 1914 this really, really kind of this very, very tense situation in Europe that, although people didn't necessarily recognize right away, was just ready to boil over given a spark, and that assassination would prove to be the spark.